The morning sun cast long shadows across the small Anchorage airport as 12-year-old Michael Chen fidgeted with his backpack straps. His mother, Sarah Chen, stood beside him, checking their boarding passes one last time. The crisp Alaskan air nipped at their faces as they walked across the tarmac toward the waiting Cessna 206. "It's smaller than I thought," Michael whispered to his mother, his eyes wide as he took in the six-seater aircraft. The plane's white and blue paint gleamed in the early morning light, and its propellers stood silent, waiting to spring to life. Captain James Harrison, a man in his mid-50s with gray temples and laugh lines around his eyes, stepped out of the plane to greet them. He had been flying these routes for over 20 years, and his weathered face showed every mile of Alaska's skies he traveled. He smiled warmly at Michael, noticing the boy's NASA t-shirt and the way his eyes kept darting to the cockpit. "First time flying in a small plane?" Harrison asked, extending his hand to Michael. Michael nodded eagerly. "I've only been on big commercial planes before. This is so cool." His enthusiasm made the pilot chuckle as he helped them load their bags into the cargo compartment. The other passengers arrived shortly after, an elderly couple, the Petersons, who were heading home after visiting their grandchildren, and a young businessman named Tom Walsh, who frequently used the small aircraft service for his work trips. The tight-knit community of Alaska's remote villages meant that small planes like this were as common as buses in other parts of the country. Inside the plane, Michael couldn't contain his excitement as he secured his seatbelt. His mother sat beside him, reviewing some medical documents. She was a nurse at Anchorage General Hospital and was taking a few days off to visit Michael's grandparents in their remote village. Michael pulled out his tablet, which was loaded with his favorite flight simulator games. "Mom, look," he exclaimed, pointing to the cockpit. "The controls look just like in my games." Sarah smiled indulgently at her son's enthusiasm. Ever since his father had given him that first flight simulator game 3 years ago, Michael had been obsessed with aviation. He spent countless hours playing different scenarios, learning about various aircraft, and watching YouTube videos about flying. Captain Harrison went through his pre-flight checklist methodically, his experienced hands moving across the instruments with familiar ease. He spoke into his headset, receiving clearance from the control tower. The propeller began to spin, and the engine's steady hum filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison announced over the intercom, "welcome aboard. Our flight time to Copper Valley will be approximately 90 minutes. Weather reports show some clouds ahead, but nothing we can't handle. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and enjoy the flight." As they taxied down the runway, Michael pressed his face against the window, watching the ground crew give their final signals. The small plane gathered speed, and Michael felt his stomach flutter as they lifted off the ground. The buildings of Anchorage grew smaller below them, and soon they were climbing through wispy morning clouds. Mrs. Peterson dozed off almost immediately, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. Tom Walsh pulled out his laptop and began typing, while Sarah opened a novel she'd been saving for the trip. Michael, however, couldn't take his eyes off the landscape unfolding beneath them. The vast Alaskan wilderness stretched out in every direction, endless forests, winding rivers, and snow-capped mountains. Captain Harrison occasionally pointed out landmarks over the intercom, sharing interesting facts about the region's geography and history. Michael absorbed every word, occasionally comparing the real-world view to what he'd seen in his flight simulator games. About 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed her son taking careful notes in a small notebook he brought along. "What are you writing, sweetie?" she asked. "I'm recording everything about the flight," Michael replied seriously. "The altitude, the speed, the way Captain Harrison handles the controls. Dad always says that real pilots keep detailed logs." Sarah felt a pang in her heart at the mention of Michael's father, who had passed away 2 years ago. He had been a private pilot himself, and Michael's love of aviation was like a living connection to him. As they cruised at 12,000 feet, none of the passengers could have known that this routine morning flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The next hour would test their courage, challenge their assumptions, and transform young Michael Chen's life forever. The first sign of trouble came about an hour into the flight. Captain Harrison's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone professional but carrying an edge of concern. "Folks, we're picking up some unexpected weather ahead. I'm going to try to find us a smoother route around it." Michael looked out of his window and saw the previously clear sky had transformed. Dark clouds loomed ahead, their massive shapes resembling angry giants. The small Cessna seemed tiny compared to the wall of weather they were approaching. He glanced at his mother, who had put away her book and was gripping the armrest tightly. The first jolt caught everyone by surprise. Tom Walsh's laptop almost slid off his knees, and Mrs. Peterson woke up with a startled gasp. The plane shuddered as if it had hit an invisible speed bump in the sky. Captain Harrison's hands moved steadily across the controls, making constant adjustments. "Just some turbulence, folks," Harrison reassured them. "Pretty common in these parts, especially when weather systems collide." But Michael, who had spent countless hours studying weather patterns in his flight simulator games, noticed something concerning. The clouds ahead weren't just gray. They had a greenish tinge that he recognized from his weather studies as a sign of severe conditions. The turbulence grew worse. The plane dropped suddenly, causing everyone's stomachs to lurch. Sarah reached over and grabbed Michael's hand, but to her surprise, she found her son surprisingly calm. He was watching the wings flex with each bump and gust, remembering from his reading that they were designed to bend this way. "Mom," Michael whispered, "look at how the ailerons are moving." He pointed to the hinged sections on the wings' edges. "The pilot is trying to keep us stable by adjusting them constantly." Rain began pelting the windows, drumming against the metal skin of the aircraft. The visibility dropped dramatically, and the morning sun disappeared entirely behind the thick cloud cover. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere grew tense. Mr. Peterson was quietly praying, while his wife clutched his arm. Tom Walsh had given up on his work and was staring straight ahead, his face pale. Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom again, sounding slightly strained. "We're going to try to climb above this weather system. Everyone please make sure your seatbelts are tight." The engine's pitch changed as the plane began to ascend, searching for clearer air. Michael watched the altimeter in the cockpit slowly climb. 13,000 feet, 14,000 feet, 15,000 feet. The air grew noticeably thinner, and the temperature in the cabin dropped. Sarah pulled their jackets from under the seats and helped Michael put his on. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in brilliant white bursts. The thunder that followed was deafening, even over the sound of the engine. The plane rocked violently from side to side, and loose items in the cabin shifted and rolled. "How high can we go?" Michael asked his mother, his voice steady despite the situation. Sarah shook her head, unsure of the answer, but Michael continued. "Small planes like this usually can't go much above 18,000 feet because they're not pressurized like big commercial planes." Through gaps in the clouds, Michael caught glimpses of the wilderness below. The forests and mountains that had looked so peaceful earlier now seemed remote and forbidding. He could see sheets of rain sweeping across the landscape and occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the terrain. Captain Harrison was in constant communication with air traffic control now, his voice a steady stream of technical terms and coordinates. Michael strained to hear the conversation, recognizing some of the aviation terminology from his games and studies. Suddenly, the plane shuddered violently, worse than before. A metallic rattling sound came from somewhere in the aircraft, and the engine's steady hum developed an irregular pattern. Michael noticed Captain Harrison's movements becoming more urgent, his hands moving faster across the controls. The tension in the cabin reached a new level as the plane began to shake continuously. Sarah pulled Michael closer to her, but he remained focused on the cockpit, watching Harrison's every move. Something about the pilot's posture had changed. He seemed to be leaning forward more, his movements becoming less precise. None of the passengers realized it yet, but Captain Harrison was fighting more than just the weather. As sweat beaded on his forehead and his left arm began to tingle, the experienced pilot was experiencing the early signs of something that would turn this frightening flight into a desperate fight for survival. The true test of courage was about to begin, and Michael Chen's years of flight simulator gaming were about to become more valuable than anyone could have imagined. The moment that changed everything happened without warning. Captain Harrison's right hand suddenly clutched at his chest, his face contorted in pain. The Cessna lurched as his grip on the controls loosened. For a terrifying moment, nobody in the passenger cabin realized what was happening. They were all too focused on the storm outside. It was Michael who noticed first. His eyes, which had been fixed on the cockpit throughout the turbulence, saw Harrison slump forward. The pilot's headset slipped askew, and his shoulders sagged against the seat straps. The plane began to nose downward, its descent gentle at first but steadily increasing. "Mom," Michael's voice cut through the storm noise. "Something's wrong with the pilot." Sarah Chen looked up, her nursing instincts kicking in immediately. She unbuckled her seatbelt and rushed forward, bracing herself against the seats as the plane continued to pitch and roll. The other passengers realized the gravity of the situation as Sarah reached the cockpit. "Captain Harrison," she called out, shaking his shoulder. When he didn't respond, she quickly checked his pulse. "He's having a heart attack," she announced, her professional calm masking her inner terror. Tom Walsh unbuckled and moved to help, but another violent shake of the plane sent him stumbling back to his seat. The Petersons held each other tightly, their faces ashen with fear. Outside, lightning continued to flash, illuminating the chaos within the small aircraft. Sarah worked quickly, laying Harrison's seat back as much as possible in the cramped cockpit. The plane was losing altitude now, the numbers on the altimeter spinning downward. Through the windshield, dark clouds rushed past, occasionally breaking to show glimpses of the threatening ground below. "Does anyone know how to fly?" Mrs. Peterson's frightened voice barely carried over the storm. Tom Walsh shook his head helplessly. Mr. Peterson, a retired bus driver, looked equally lost. The plane continued its descent, now at a steeper angle. Sarah was torn between helping the pilot and trying to control the aircraft. Her medical training told her that Harrison needed immediate attention, but every second the plane remained without a pilot brought them closer to disaster. She reached for the controls, but her hands hesitated. She had no idea what to do. Michael watched all of this unfold, his mind racing. The scene before him was eerily similar to one of the emergency scenarios he practiced countless times in his flight simulator. He knew the Cessna 206 layout by heart. Every switch, every dial, every control surface. He crashed hundreds of times in the simulator, learning from each mistake. The altimeter showed 10,000 feet and falling. The airspeed was increasing as they descended through the storm. Warning alerts began to sound in the cockpit, their urgent beeping adding to the chaos. Sarah had started chest compressions on Harrison, knowing that his survival, and theirs, depended on immediate medical attention. Michael unbuckled his seatbelt, his heart pounding but his hands steady. He'd read about situations like this, about ordinary people forced to fly planes in emergencies. He knew their chances weren't good, but they were better than no chance at all. "Mom," he said, his voice stronger than he felt, "I can fly it." Sarah looked at her son, momentarily stopping the chest compressions. "The controls are just like my simulator. I've done this hundreds of times." "Michael, this isn't a game," Sarah began, but another sharp drop in altitude cut her off. The ground was becoming more visible now, the Alaskan wilderness rushing up to meet them. They were running out of options. "Trust me," Michael pleaded. "I know this plane. I know what to do." His eyes met his mother's, and in that moment, she saw something in them she'd never noticed before. Not just determination, but genuine understanding. Tom Walsh's voice came from behind them, strained but clear. "Let him try. We don't have any other choice." The plane pitched again, and more warning alerts joined the chorus in the cockpit. They had descended to 8,000 feet, and the rate of descent was increasing. Harrison remained unconscious, his fate now in Sarah's hands, while the fate of everyone else hung in the balance. Michael took a deep breath and stepped forward. This was no longer a simulation on his tablet. This was real life, with real consequences and real lives at stake. As he reached for the controls, his hands trembling slightly, he shouted the words that would define this moment. "Let me fly the plane." The crisis had reached its turning point, and the next few minutes would determine whether this would become a tragedy or a miracle at 8,000 feet. Time seemed to freeze for a moment as Michael took control of the aircraft. His mother had dragged Captain Harrison's unconscious form back just enough to give Michael access to the pilot's seat. The boy's hands gripped the yoke, and despite the terror of the situation, they felt surprisingly steady. First things first, Michael muttered to himself, recalling his countless hours of simulation practice. He scanned the instrument panel quickly, airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon. The numbers were dropping fast. They were now at 7,500 feet and descending at an alarming rate. Sarah had positioned Harrison in the co-pilot's seat and was continuing chest compressions while Tom Walsh held the pilot's head steady. Mrs. Peterson had found the first aid kit and was ready to assist. The elderly couple's faces showed a mix of terror and desperate hope as they watched a 12-year-old boy take command of their fate. Michael's first action was to level the plane. He pulled back gently on the yoke, careful not to overcorrect. The artificial horizon slowly stabilized, and the desperate dive began to level out. The warnings in the cockpit continued to blare, but Michael forced himself to focus through the noise. "We need to contact someone," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Mr. Walsh, can you reach the radio?" Tom Walsh leaned forward, his hands shaking as he picked up the fallen headset. Michael remembered the emergency frequency from his studies, 121.5 MHz. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Walsh spoke into the microphone, his voice cracking. "This is Cessna 206, November 347 Alpha Bravo. Our pilot is unconscious. We have a child flying the plane." The response came almost immediately, crackling through the storm static. "November 347 Alpha Bravo. This is Anchorage Center. Say again. Did you say a child is flying the aircraft?" Michael nodded to Walsh, who confirmed the situation. There was a brief pause before the controller's voice returned, now speaking slowly and clearly. "Okay, young man, can you tell me your name and age?" "Michael Chen," he replied through Walsh. "I'm 12. I know this plane from my flight simulator. We're at 7,000 feet and leveling off." He glanced at the instruments again. "Airspeed 120 knots. Heading 240. Another pause from the controller. When the voice returned, it carried a note of cautious optimism. "Okay, Michael, you're doing great. We're tracking your position. Can you tell me about your fuel situation?" Michael's eyes found the fuel gauges, both tanks showing just under half full. He remembered another critical detail. We were headed to Copper Valley when the storm hit. Captain Harrison was trying to climb over it. While this exchange was happening, Sarah continued working on Harrison. The pilot's color was poor, but she had managed to maintain a pulse through CPR. Mrs. Peterson had found a small oxygen bottle in the emergency kit and was helping to administer it. The storm continued to buffet the small plane, but Michael found that his simulator experience was indeed helping. He made small, constant corrections, keeping the wings level and fighting the turbulence. His mind was eerily clear, operating on a mixture of adrenaline and focused concentration. "November 347 Alpha Bravo," the controller's voice returned. "Michael, we're going to direct you to the nearest suitable airport. There's a regional airport about 40 miles southeast of your position. The weather is better there." Michael felt a surge of relief. 40 miles was manageable. He'd flown much longer distances in his simulations, but this was different. Lives depended on every move he made, every decision he took. His mother's life, the Petersons, Mr. Walsh's, and Captain Harrison's, if they could keep him alive long enough to reach help. "I can do it," Michael said, both to the controller and to himself. He looked at his mother, who was still performing CPR with unwavering determination. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw in her face a complex mixture of fear, pride, and trust. The plane continued to shake in the turbulent air, but Michael kept it steady. Each second that passed made him more confident in his abilities, though he knew the hardest part was yet to come. They would have to descend through the storm, find the airport, and somehow land the aircraft. All tasks he'd only ever performed in virtual reality. As the controller began giving him specific heading instructions, Michael took a deep breath. The next 30 minutes would put everything he'd learned to the ultimate test. The decision to take control had been made. Now he had to prove it was the right one. "Turn right heading 180 degrees. The air traffic controller instructed through the radio, which Tom Walsh continued to relay to Michael. The boy eased the yoke to the right, watching the heading indicator slowly move. His eyes darted between the instruments, just as he practiced countless times in his simulator. Sarah had finally gotten Captain Harrison into a stable position. The pilot was still unconscious, but his pulse had steadied thanks to her continuous care. Mrs. Peterson had taken over monitoring his vital signs, allowing Sarah to move closer to Michael, ready to help if needed. "Wings level," Michael murmured to himself as he completed the turn. The storm was still raging around them, but they had found a pocket of slightly calmer air. Through breaks in the clouds, he could occasionally see the Alaskan wilderness below. vast forests and winding rivers that looked like miniature models from their altitude. The controller's voice crackled through again. Michael, we need you to start a gradual descent. Aim for 6,000 feet to start. Can you do that? Michael nodded, then remembered to verbally respond through Walsh. Yes, I can. In the simulator, I usually reduce power slightly and pitch down about 3 degrees. There was a brief pause before the controller responded, and Michael could almost hear the surprise in his voice at the boy's technical knowledge. That's exactly right, son. Proceed with your descent. With careful movements, Michael adjusted the throttle and eased the nose down. The altimeter began to wind down slowly, and he kept his eyes fixed on the vertical speed indicator, making sure they weren't descending too quickly. Mom, Michael said, his voice steady despite the pressure, can you look out the left window and tell me if you see any breaks in the clouds? Sarah moved to the window, pressing her face against the glass. The Petersons did the same on the right side, everyone working together as a team. There's a patch of clearer sky about 2 miles out, Sarah reported. Michael adjusted their course slightly, aiming for the break in the weather. He'd learned in his studies that finding visual reference points was crucial for navigation, especially in challenging conditions. The radio crackled again. November 347 Alpha Bravo, you're doing great. The regional airport is now 25 miles ahead. Weather reports show conditions are improving in that direction. As if to confirm this, the turbulence began to decrease. The sun occasionally broke through the clouds, casting brief spotlights on the aircraft's wings. Michael maintained his focus on the instruments, making constant small corrections to keep them stable. 6,000 feet, he announced as they leveled off at their new altitude. The air was clearer here, and visibility had improved significantly. Michael felt his confidence growing with each passing minute. The controls felt more natural now, responding just as they had in his countless hours of simulation practice. Tom Walsh had been coordinating with the ground controller, providing updates about Harrison's condition and their fuel status. They have emergency services standing by at the airport, he reported, and they've cleared all other traffic from the area. Michael knew they were still far from safe. Landing would be the biggest challenge, something he practiced hundreds of times virtually but never in reality. But first, they had to reach the airport, and every mile of stable flight brought them closer to that goal. Michael, Sarah said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, you're doing amazingly well. He gave her a quick smile but kept his eyes on the instruments. The heading indicator showed they were perfectly on course, and the airspeed was holding steady at 120 knots. The next radio transmission brought both relief and new anxiety. November 347 Alpha Bravo, we have you on radar. Airport is now 20 miles ahead. Time to start planning your approach. Michael took a deep breath. He knew what was coming next, the most critical phase of flight. They would need to decrease altitude further, configure the aircraft for landing, and somehow get the plane safely on the ground. The lives of everyone aboard still hung in the balance. But as he looked at the increasingly clear sky ahead, Michael felt a strange sense of calm. All those hours spent in front of his flight simulator, all the times his father had encouraged his interest in aviation, all the technical books he'd read, it had all been preparing him for this moment. The real test was about to begin. The regional airport appeared on the horizon like a miracle. 2 strips of gray concrete cutting through the green Alaskan landscape. Michael could see it through breaks in the now thinning clouds, exactly where the controller said it would be. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the terrain. Airport in sight, Michael announced through Tom Walsh, who continued to relay messages. His hands were sweating on the controls, but his voice remained steady. He knew the next few minutes would be the most challenging of all. The controller's voice came through clearly. November 347 Alpha Bravo, you're cleared for a straight-in approach to runway 27. Wind is from the west at 8 knots. You'll want to start descending to pattern altitude. Michael nodded, remembering his training. We need to get down to about 2,000 feet, he explained to his mother, who hadn't left his side. Then we'll need to slow down and get ready for landing. Sarah squeezed his shoulder supportively while continuing to monitor Captain Harrison. The pilot's condition had stabilized thanks to her continuous care, but he remained unconscious. The Petersons had their faces pressed against the windows, watching their destination grow larger with each passing minute. Throttle back slightly, Michael murmured to himself, easing the power lever back. The engine's pitch changed, and the nose dipped gently. He watched the airspeed indicator carefully. Too fast would make landing dangerous, too slow could cause them to stall. The controller provided constant guidance. You're on a good approach path. Remember to keep your speed up until you're ready to configure for landing. Michael could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves along the runway, their lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. At 4,000 feet, they passed through a final layer of clouds. The air became smoother, and the visibility improved dramatically. The airport layout was now clearly visible. Michael could see the runway numbers, the taxiways, and the small terminal building. Time to get ready, Michael said, his gaming experience guiding his actions. Mr. Walsh, can you look for a checklist? There should be one in a pocket near you. Walsh found the laminated card and began reading items aloud. Landing gear. Walsh started. Fixed gear on this model, Michael interrupted. We don't need to worry about that. Flaps? Not yet. We'll add those in stages. The controller's voice returned. Start your final descent now. Aim for the runway numbers. You're doing great, Michael. With careful movements, Michael eased the plane down toward pattern altitude. The airspeed was holding steady at 100 knots, slower than their cruise speed but still safe. He could feel every bump and movement of the aircraft more intensely now as the air grew denser at lower altitude. First notch of flaps, Michael commanded, remembering the procedure from his simulations. Mrs. Peterson, who had been helping monitor Harrison, reached over and moved the flap lever as directed. The plane's nose lifted slightly as the flaps extended, and Michael compensated with forward pressure on the yoke. The runway was growing larger now. Michael could see the white centerline stripe and the touchdown markers. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the runway, their lights creating a pathway of red and blue flashes. 3 miles to touchdown, the controller announced. Start reducing speed. Add more flaps when ready. Michael's throat felt dry. In his simulator, he could always hit the reset button if something went wrong. Here, there would be no second chances. 6 lives depended on the next few minutes. Second notch of flaps, he called out. The plane slowed further, and he had to adjust the trim to maintain their descent angle. The controls felt heavier now, more sluggish, just as they had in his virtual practice sessions. Sarah watched her son with a mixture of terror and pride. His face showed intense concentration as he guided the aircraft down. The boy who had spent countless hours playing flight simulator games was now putting all that practice to the ultimate test. The airport was now filling their windscreen. Michael could see individual vehicles and people on the ground. The radio crackled with final instructions from the controller, but everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. 2 miles to go. The most critical part of their journey was about to begin, and Michael knew that everything he had learned would be tested in the next few minutes. The approach was nearly complete, but the hardest part still lay ahead. 1 mile from the runway threshold, time seemed to slow down for Michael Chen. The control tower had cleared all radio frequencies except theirs, and an eerie silence filled the air, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the whine of the wind around their aircraft. Final flaps, Michael called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Peterson moved the flap lever to its final position. The plane shuddered as the flaps extended fully, and Michael felt the controls become even heavier in his hands. The airspeed indicator showed 75 knots, exactly what he practiced for landing in his simulator. Half a mile to runway, the controller's voice was calm but intense. You're right on the glide path. Keep it coming. Michael could see everything now, the rubber marks on the runway from previous landings, the painted numbers growing larger, the emergency vehicles standing ready. He made tiny adjustments to keep the plane aligned with the centerline, just as he'd done hundreds of times in his virtual world. Sarah held her breath beside him. Captain Harrison remained unconscious but stable in the co-pilot's seat. Tom Walsh and the Petersons sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed on the approaching runway. The fate of everyone aboard rested in the hands of a 12-year-old boy. Remember, Michael whispered to himself, pull back gently when the runway's close. Not too much, not too little. His father's voice seemed to echo in his head, from the times they played the flight simulator together. Landing is just a controlled descent until you run out of air. The runway threshold passed beneath them. Michael kept his eyes moving between the airspeed indicator and the view outside. The ground was rushing up to meet them now, growing closer with each passing second. 50 feet, the controller counted down. 40, 30. Michael began to pull back slowly on the yoke, raising the nose just slightly. The runway filled his entire field of view. 20 feet, 10. The stall warning horn began to chirp, exactly as it had in the simulator. Michael held steady, fighting the urge to pull back too hard. The ground grew closer and closer. Then came the moment of truth. The main wheels touched down with a screech of rubber on concrete. The plane bounced slightly, higher than Michael would have liked. He held the yoke steady, remembering that overcorrection now could be disastrous. The second touchdown was smoother. The nose wheel settled onto the runway, and Michael felt the full weight of the aircraft connect with solid ground. They were still moving fast, too fast. "Brakes," he said through gritted teeth, pressing the pedals carefully. The plane began to slow, but the end of the runway seemed to be approaching too quickly. Michael pressed a little harder on the brakes, feeling the aircraft shudder as it decelerated. Emergency vehicles began moving alongside them as they slowed. Michael kept the plane centered on the runway, using small rudder inputs to maintain control. Finally, their speed dropped to a safe taxi rate, and Michael felt his whole body begin to shake as the adrenaline started to wear off. "November 347 Alpha Bravo, you've done it." The controller's voice broke through, carrying unmistakable emotion. "Turn left at the next taxiway when able. Emergency services will guide you in." Sarah wrapped her arms around her son, tears streaming down her face. The Petersons were crying too, and Tom Walsh sat back in his seat, looking pale but relieved. Captain Harrison was already being attended to by paramedics who had rushed to the plane as soon as it cleared the runway. Michael followed the emergency vehicle's guidance to a stopping point near the terminal. His hands were trembling as he moved through the shutdown checklist that Walsh read to him. When the propeller finally stopped spinning, an absolute silence fell over the cabin. For a moment, no one moved. Then the cabin door opened, and the rush of fresh air seemed to break the spell. Emergency personnel swarmed the aircraft, helping passengers disembark and transferring Captain Harrison to a waiting ambulance. As Michael stepped onto solid ground on shaking legs, he heard applause. Airport staff, emergency responders, and onlookers who had gathered to witness the emergency landing were clapping and cheering. But Michael barely noticed them. He was watching the ambulance carrying Captain Harrison, hoping the pilot would be okay. His mother hugged him tightly as they stood on the tarmac. They had made it. Against all odds, a 12-year-old boy had landed a plane and saved 6 lives. The flight was over, but Michael Chen's story was just beginning. 2 weeks after the emergency landing, Michael Chen stood nervously in the hospital corridor, clutching a small gift bag. His mother Sarah stood beside him as they waited outside Captain Harrison's room. The pilot had survived his heart attack thanks to Sarah's quick action and skilled emergency care after landing. "He's eager to meet you," the nurse said, opening the door. Inside, Captain Harrison sat up in his bed, looking pale but alert. His face broke into a warm smile when he saw Michael. "So this is the young man who landed my plane," Harrison said, his voice still weak but filled with gratitude. "Come here, son. I've been waiting to thank you properly." Michael approached the bed, suddenly shy despite all the media attention he'd received over the past 2 weeks. News of his landing had spread across the country. "Young hero saves flight," and 12-year-old pilot lands plane had dominated headlines. He'd been interviewed on national television and received messages from pilots worldwide. "I brought you something," Michael said, handing over the gift bag. Inside was a flight simulator game, the same one he'd used to learn about flying. Harrison laughed, understanding the significance. "You know," Harrison said, "I've been flying for 30 years, and I never thought I'd owe my life to a video game." He reached for a box beside his bed. "I have something for you too." Inside the box was a logbook, a real pilot's logbook. On the first page, Harrison had written an entry for that fateful flight, listing Michael as the pilot in command. "Your first official flight hours," Harrison explained. "I had it certified by the FAA." Sarah watched the exchange with tears in her eyes. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. The Petersons had sent flowers every day, and Tom Walsh had started a college fund for Michael. Aviation schools across the country had offered him future scholarships. But the biggest surprise had come from the Federal Aviation Administration. They had created a special award for Michael's extraordinary act of courage and skill. The ceremony was scheduled for next month, where he would become the youngest person ever to receive their award for distinguished service. "I've been thinking," Harrison said, sitting up straighter. "Once I'm back on my feet, how would you like to start real flying lessons? I know a thing or two about teaching, and you've already proven you can handle an emergency." Michael's eyes lit up. "Really? But I'm not old enough for a license yet." "No," Harrison agreed, "but you're old enough to start learning. By the time you're ready for your license, you'll be the most prepared student pilot in Alaska." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A reporter from the local newspaper had arrived for a scheduled interview. Over the past weeks, Michael had gotten better at telling his story, though he always made sure to credit his mother's medical skills, the air traffic controller's guidance, and his father's early encouragement of his interest in aviation. After the interview, as they walked through the hospital parking lot, Sarah noticed her son was unusually quiet. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "I was thinking about Dad," Michael replied. "Do you think he would have been proud?" Sarah stopped walking and knelt to face her son. "Michael, he would have been more than proud. He always said you had a natural feel for flying. He saw something special in you." The next day, Michael returned to school, where his classmates still treated him like a celebrity. But his teachers noticed a change in him. He was more focused, especially in his science and math classes. He discovered that his video game hobby had turned into something real and meaningful. That evening, as Michael sat at his desk doing homework, he glanced at the framed newspaper article on his wall. The headline read, "Pilot Down, Kid Up. The Miraculous Landing That Saved 6 Lives." Below it was his father's old pilot's license, which Sarah had framed alongside the article. His tablet lay nearby, the flight simulator game still installed. But Michael didn't play it as often now. Instead, he spent his free time studying real aviation textbooks, preparing for the day when he could finally earn his own pilot's license. On his desk calendar, he'd circled a date 6 years in the future, his 18th birthday. That would be the day he could officially become a licensed pilot. But he already knew that his real first flight had happened on that stormy afternoon when necessity had thrust him into the pilot's seat. Michael Chen had discovered his calling at 12 years old, in the most dramatic way possible, and this was just the beginning of his journey into the skies.